Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there, a very good evening and welcome to another edition of Newsline, coming to you, as always, live and direct from our Newsfirst studios here in Colombo. If you have been a person who's not too interested in the state of the economy in Sri Lanka, you know, there's this notion among the general public that if we earn, we will be able to live, and not really concerned about the broader perspective of the economy of Sri Lanka. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic would have taught you, at least, that the state of the economy in Sri Lanka is as important as your household economy. With the massive import bans that have been introduced in Sri Lanka and various other restrictions, the people have been pushed to a breaking point. Now, with the increase in fuel prices, there is a controversy surrounding this, and besides the rhetoric between government MPs and members of parliament on who is to blame, we should not move away from the core of the issue, that is the state of the economy here in Sri Lanka. And to discuss these matters and more, we've got the research manager at Advocata Institute, Aneetha Warusavitarana. A very good evening and welcome to the show.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Aneetha, first questions I'd like to ask you. There was a controversy surrounding the import of vehicles for ministers. Now, many people were very, very sensitive to this issue because general common sense dictates that when in a crisis, you take care of the people first, the most vulnerable people first. And this wasn't one of those people first people first policies. This was even against the policy statement that was presented by the president and some of the promises that were given in the run-up to the general election, where they said that vehicles will not be imported for MPs and parliamentarians for a period of 3 years. But however, yesterday, MP Lohan Ratwathar came out to the media and said that this is not going to be a burden on the public of Sri Lanka. Sri Lankans will not have to pay for these vehicles. This is simply a credit line. And if we do not purchase these vehicles at this time, we would have lost an opportunity. What does he really mean by this?
So I think what we need to really understand here is that regardless of whether this is a credit line or a letter of credit through which they're getting these imports into the country, at the end of the day a payment has to be made. So in my understanding, if we have a line of credit, then this is, I believe what the MP had said was, this is a line of credit that was opened previously and it's available to the country, so we might as well use it. That may be true, but then I think what we have to first understand is that this is not a gift. We have to pay the money at the end of the day, which means that the impact is finally felt by the Treasury and by extension by the Sri Lankans. And then, like you said, we also have to think of the timing of this decision and the sort of reflection of government priorities. We are in the middle of a pandemic. We are in the middle of the third wave that we are currently seeing in Sri Lanka, and the human cost is unimaginable. And the economic cost, as quantified, is also very, very significant and is adding to that human cost. So given this, I feel like what we need to be focusing on here is how is the government going to be prioritizing its expenditure in a year in which we are facing some serious fiscal constraints and also facing some serious expenditure demands when you look at the health sector.
So speaking of the fiscal constraints that we're currently facing, one of the biggest issues that Sri Lanka is grappling with is a lack of foreign reserves. And this has been the reason for the import restrictions in the country. Also, certain factions allege that was one of the main reasons behind the ban on importing this inorganic fertilizer into the country. However, when we speak of especially the increase in oil prices here in Sri Lanka, I know that the general public is very emotional when it comes to increase in fuel prices in the country, because that means life gets harder for everyone. Despite your social status, probably maybe the ultra-rich in the country are not going to feel it too much, but for the general public, no matter what class you live in, the middle class, the lower middle class, the lower class, whichever class you live in, you will be affected by the fuel oil increase, because it will result in many other price hikes in utility bills, food, other things. Is this really fair at a time like this?
So I think maybe what we need to be thinking about is not whether it's fair or not, because at the end of the day, you do need to purchase fuel. Sri Lanka there's a demand for us to purchase fuel, and therefore we purchase fuel, and you have to pay money for that. But I think what we have to, and definitely, like you said, we're going to, because this is such a sort of abrupt price increase. We haven't seen a revision in our fuel prices for over a year. So people have kind of gotten used to one price. We haven't seen any sort of signaling that prices are going to change, and now there is this abrupt change. So yes, there will be this sort of first order effect that people will feel on their pockets directly, and there will also be a sort of second order effect where transportation costs, manufacturing costs will also be affected, maybe to a lesser degree because fuel would only be a component of that whole cost. But I feel like what we need to be thinking about here is, like, now the price has increased because global prices have also increased. How do you solve this as from a policy perspective long term? This is not a path we should be following for the next few years, where there are ad hoc changes in prices and people are taken unawares. The fact that there is no indication that prices will increase is a big part of the problem. So I think that is where we need to be focusing attention.
So there was a fuel pricing formula that was introduced before. This was before the new government came into power, and that fuel pricing formula based on the price of the global oil market, how crude oil is sold in the global market. So that was the basis of that formula. Are you suggesting a similar formula would work?
So yes, ideally the solution that would work best here would be a fuel pricing formula. That is very important. A very important sort of caveat to this fuel pricing formula is that this formula is transparent. The way in which it is calculated is made available to the public. It is vetted by the relevant authorities, and it is transparent. So we can understand how this formula works, how it is linked to international prices. And then what you will see is that if you have a fuel price formula in place, and instead of these one-off abrupt price increases or price decreases, which would have an impact on people's cost of living, on inflation, you would have small changes reflecting global price changes, and that is far more manageable, and more importantly, you're allowing the price to serve its signaling function in the market. So if you take the current situation we're in, there has been no price information, right? It's just been that this is the price of fuel, and that is the price of fuel it has been for over a year, and now there's a sudden change. So instead of that, okay, this is how things are changing, and consumers, businesses can adapt accordingly. They can take that information and act on it, and then what you see is that you don't see this. It is far more manageable, and you would also see the benefits. Consumers would reap the benefits of when international prices drop as much as when they increase, where we would feel a bit of a pinch.
Well, there was a massive drop in fuel prices last year with the COVID-19 pandemic hitting countries all over the world. However, the minister during that time, if I'm not mistaken, and I remember this distinctly because the minister himself made this statement, he said, we are not going to reduce oil prices because we are going to use the additional funds that we receive from the drop in global oil prices to set up a fuel stabilization fund so that fuel prices can be maintained at the same level even if global oil prices increases. Now, I did attempt to pose this question to the Energy Minister, Uday Gammampilla, during the press briefing that took place yesterday. However, the press briefing was focused on a more political line of discussion on the fuel price hike. So what really happened to that fund? Is there any information out there in the public domain regarding this fund?
So yes, I believe that today the newspapers have published that the fuel price stabilizing fund is actually at a loss of about 26 billion. So essentially what we're seeing is that this mechanism has not worked, and which brings us back to.
When you say the fuel price, the fund is at a loss of 26 billion, that means?
Well, it seems to be, I believe, I have an imperfect understanding of this, so I also just kind of looked into this before today's discussion to understand how this has worked. But at the end of the day, what we can definitely take away from it is that this has not it has not achieved its objective. Its objective was to provide this kind of cushion, like you said, against international prices and protect the domestic consumer. And that is not the case, as we can see right now. The price has increased. So I think what that does, what that tells us is, once again, we need to be thinking of this as a long-term policy solution, not something where governments can kind of jump in and change and do sort of piecemeal reform. Instead, think of it holistically, and how do you put in place a mechanism, this pricing formula, that will give consumers a sort of indication, a price signal, and will mean that you don't have these abrupt changes in prices.
Well, there are many within the government themselves and the opposition demanding that fuel prices be reduced to the previous level. Judging by the current state of the economy in Sri Lanka, is this a decision that is at least on the table for the government?
I mean, I can't say if it's on the table for the government, but I suppose if you look at Sri Lanka's economic situation, it is given our fiscal constraints right now. When global oil prices are rising, if we are to price our oil lower than global prices, that means the government has to compensate that gap, right? And if you look at our fiscal position, we simply can't do that. We don't have the funds readily available. We've seen a decrease in tax revenue. We've seen an increase in outflows when you look at our debt repayment schedule for this year, and when you look at it for the years to come. The external sector was hit quite badly at the start of the pandemic with the drop in exports, and although exports have revived since then, our outflows are still far greater than our inflows into the sector. So the government is very unlikely to have the space to do something like that.
Before we cross into a short commercial break, one more question that was sent in to us by one of our viewers. Was the fuel price formula that was introduced by the previous government, in your view, a better alternative than these ad hoc increases?
I mean, I think it's difficult to sort of weigh the two, because there were issues with the previous price formula as well, in that it wasn't transparent, and the mechanics of the formula weren't made available to the public, which was a huge issue. So I would say that it's a step in the right direction that you're considering price formulas and you're working towards that, but that's probably not the gold standard. We need to have a pricing formula where you have that information available to the public, where it's transparent and open, and you are able to vet the effectiveness of this formula.
Transparency and openness have never been defining features of any Sri Lankan government. We will cross over to a short commercial break. Don't go anywhere. We will be back with more on the other side.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsline live. Anisha, I'd like to start this session of Newsline, of course, with a question that came in from one of our viewers. Again, there was this fund that was set up, and there were various other mechanisms to stabilize the fuel pricing formula. Now, when the government comes forward and says that the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation is running at a loss, people are wondering, well, every time we purchase fuel from a fuel station, we pay for this fuel. If we do pay for this, where does the money go? How come the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation is running at a loss?
So I think first of all, I must make a small clarification. I believe they made a small profit in 2020, but the previous years they have been running massive losses. I think in 2019 it was about 11 billion loss.
And the accumulation of all of these losses is currently
100%.
at around, according to the statement, I believe, not accurate, but in the billions.
Yeah, easily in the billions. And if you, especially, it's 100%. If you look at accumulated accumulated losses or profits, it's definitely a loss in the billions. So one reason for this is that the government does subsidize fuel. So, we're not selling at the market rate. But there are also a host of other issues that plague Sri we see that there is rampant inefficiency. There is, if you look through the COPE reports on this, they have identified that there is corruption in state-owned enterprises in Sri Lanka. So yes, definitely the subsidy is one reason, but we also have to look at the issue as a whole. You should look at how state-owned enterprises run in Sri Lanka as a whole, and kind of understand that there are other factors at play.
So moving on this fuel price issue that Sri Lanka is currently facing, is there any hope would it be a proper mechanism to introduce some subsidies, at least for the people who have been worst hit by the COVID-19 pandemic? Say, for example, the fishing communities in Sri Lanka, the farming communities in Sri Lanka. Is this an option that the government should consider, in your opinion?
So, I mean, there are already subsidies in place, but if you're speaking of, definitely there are multiple communities in the country who have been affected very badly by the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns. Like you mentioned, the fishing communities, daily wage workers, individuals working in the informal sector. And we have seen this sort of 5,000 rupee payment being made, but there have been questions about the efficacy of this, whether it's going to enough people, whether this sum is sufficient for the month. So definitely, if you're thinking of looking at improving the delivery and the sort of rationale behind our social protection services, yes, there's definitely room there for us to improve and make sure that our sort of allocation of resources there is better than it is at present.
Anisha, one of our viewers are not quite happy about the explanation you gave regarding the what happened to the fund that was established by the government to stabilize the fuel price. And this was what was done when the global oil prices were hitting all-time lows.
Yeah.
If you could maybe...
I must apologize to this viewer that I don't know enough on that topic to give you an answer, which is why I don't have an answer to that. But
of course, we too tried to question the Minister of Energy and so on and so forth, but there has not been a clear statement given by the government. Yesterday, there was a communique issued by the President's Media Division, and in this communique, the President speaks of the reasons behind the increase in the fuel prices and the decision to increase in fuel prices, and among them are the massive losses, like you pointed out, that are being suffered by the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, and also besides these methods that you spoke of, that we could maybe go towards a long-term solution to this issue that we're facing almost on a monthly basis sometimes, but this time on a yearly basis. They have proposed to ban the import of vehicles that run on fuel and instead promote the use of electric cars and electric vehicles. In your view?
I think one thing we have to understand is that, first of all, if you're talking about switching towards using electric vehicles as opposed to fuel-based vehicles.
All of this to reduce Sri Lanka's bill on importing fuel.
And I think that is the key point we have to think about here, because yes, Sri Lanka's electricity mix, when you look at Sri Lanka's electricity mix, hydropower plays a large component, but hydropower is most definitely dependent on the weather, and with Sri Lanka being one of the most high-risk countries when it comes to climate change, this is not something we can rely on definitely. You can't plan when it's going to rain and when it's not going to rain anymore. And at present, we don't rely only on hydro. We also import in fuel for electricity.
I believe there were a number of instances where there were even emergency purchases of fuel, and these fuel come from diesel, other oil-based power plants.
Exactly, and that is to meet our current demand. So if we're going to be increasing our demand by switching cars over to electricity, to electric cars, then we have to, we have to think about how we are going to be fueling that electricity demand as well. But apart from that, so there is the very real possibility that you're not going to actually meet the objective of reducing your fuel imports by switching to electric cars. But apart from that, I think if you're looking looking at it from a policy perspective, if you want if the idea is to reduce our fuel imports, maybe we need to be thinking of the larger problem at hand here. How is our external sector performing, and how can we help that external sector kind of recover from where we are right now? Yes, the import restrictions that were placed meant that our import bill has dropped drastically, and it's picking up slowly now as restrictions are being eased. But this is not really a feasible solution in the long run. We can't. It's really not very feasible. So we need to be thinking of long-term solutions to this very real problem.
Well, moving on, we also see many other imports, even right now as we speak. There are import bans on many items. There are import bans on fertilizers. That's a different issue entirely, but in general, there is an import ban currently on vehicles, many other goods that are non-essential items. How long do you think that Sri Lanka can really continue with a blanket ban on all of these imports?
Well, I think that is very difficult to say, because we have continued for far longer than I think many people thought we would be able to. But it's definitely going to take a toll on the economy in the long run if we don't have imports coming in. We have been kind of managing by allowing imports to come in if there are intermediate goods used for manufacturing, so that our export sector doesn't fall behind. But a lot of other small local businesses do rely on imported inputs into production, and they are not exporting export companies. So you're hitting various sectors of the economy by this ban. So it really shouldn't be a long-term solution to our problems, is what I would say.
Well, speaking on the state of the economy in Sri Lanka, there are currency swaps that we go into. We went into currency swap with Bangladesh, with China, and the government is also mulling over large infrastructure development projects. Now, when Sri Lankans think of development, we kind of tend to think of materialistic development. We see a road coming up, okay, development is taking place. We see a building coming up, okay, development is taking place. But is this the true measure of development?
I would argue that it isn't. Infrastructure-led investment into the country will create a sort of temporary, will give a temporary boost to the economy. We'll see a temporary rise in economic growth, but unless it's infrastructure investment that is going to create jobs, that's going to actually add long-term value to the economy, you're not going to see that as a sustainable, that it's not going to create sustainable growth.
One more concern that the general public is having right now, Anisha, is the statement made by former Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe regarding Sri Lanka's possible risk that Sri Lanka is facing of losing the GSP Plus concession. Now, the GSP Plus concession, in short, is a blanket concession that we've been given by the European Union to export our products to the European Union without any taxes. And losing this GSP Plus concession would greatly affect Sri Lanka, as Europe is one of the biggest markets that Sri Lanka exports to: apparels, fisheries products, many other items. Anisha, is there really a possibility that if Sri Lanka loses the GSP Plus concession, this could have such an impact on Sri Lankan economy that it will push the Sri Lankan rupee to hit 300 rupees against the dollar?
Well, this is what people are sort of estimating. And I think it'll be very difficult to say how badly the rupee would depreciate until it actually happens. But if we lose the GSP Plus concession, it would be a massive hit to Sri Lanka's export sector. And if you look at what is one of the things that are kind of propping up our economy right now, it is the export sector. And we've seen, this, above 60% pickup since the initial drop from at the start of the pandemic. But one of the problems that are inherent to Sri Lanka's export sector is that we don't have very diversified markets. The EU is our biggest. 30% of our exports, I believe, go to the EU. So we lose the GSP Plus concession, that is going to hit the export sector very, very badly. And I believe the EDB chairperson has mentioned that our apparel sector in particular is going to be hit quite badly. And apparels contribute, about about 50% of our exports. It's a large component of our exports that we're talking about. So I think at this point we need to be thinking about what are the advantages that the export sector currently has and how can we keep them, and then of course going forward how can we improve them and give more opportunity for that sector to grow.
Thank you very much, Anisha, for joining us on our show and clarifying these matters to the general public. Of course, there were many questions that I received regarding what happened really to this fuel stabilization fund that was established by the government. Where did the funds go? How did this fund really suffer a loss, according to the article quoted by Anisha? News First will keep close watch on this and keep you informed. Until then, do stay tuned to Newsline every day at 8:30 p.m. as you all know. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.